Thank you all three of you for fantastic presentations. I'm an oral historian, so Anne's presentation really warmed my heart. All of your presentations were great, but it was so great to see quotes from Alexander Patel, for example. And I also think your presentation showed us how oral history also can inform Holocaust studies in a way. And I want to go back to this, should you really interview Kinder or use archive interviews? And I think one thing we can learn from your work, and I'm really looking forward to read everything you publish, is that the interviewer also counts. Because in Holocaust studies we talk a lot about testimonies and the survivor, but what happens when you change the interviewer, and a lot of us here working with Hank Greenspan, for example, on listening to Holocaust survivors and how he had worked with the same survivors for many years. But what happens when you change Hank? I was wondering when I listened to your presentation, and now you have like the Wales perspective in your interviews, but are there other aspects in your interviews that differ from the old interviews? And one more question. Where will your interviews end up? Where will you archive your interviews? Are you doing them like a contribution to the old archive, or are you creating a new archive?
Thank you. So thank you for 3 excellent presentations, a really great session that holds together very nicely. So I have sort of general comments and then specifically questions for Catherine and for Gila. It's really fascinating to think about the stages of memory that you're each talking about, 1945, 1995, 2022, and sort of both intergenerationally, to think about sort of survivor memories that evolve over the 50 years, and then also for the HSO, which I like this term, more than second generation, but we can talk about it, that also it evolves from, let's say, the 90s or the awakening of children of survivors to 2022, and how those stages of memory really matter in terms of how one relates to one's parents' experiences. The specific question I'll wait for the screen. It's for the video, so we don't have the back. So for Catherine, I'm really curious about the issue of audience, and sort of if in your father's accounts, if he reflected on this, that in 1945 you say that there was a real concern of sort of, or motivation from this British officer, that if that influenced sort of this accounting of really a testimony with detailed account of sort of who and when and where, and in 1995 did he reflect on this issue of audience, who he was writing for, and how that might have affected sort of his thoughts on that. And then for Gila, I think this last point that you made about secularization and holy martyrs, really fascinating point. And I like the idea of using Benedict Anderson and imagined communities. I think there's a lot there. Also just thinking about it in Israeli society more generally, I think that's a really rich sort of conceptual framework to work with. But I'm wondering if you can talk about, for the survivor offspring, this issue of identification with their parents' stories, especially in light of what we heard yesterday. Have you found people talking about sort of their parents' stories becoming their own stories? And if you can reflect on sort of what you've seen from the Facebook groups with what we heard yesterday with the first person, sort of that idea of their parents' stories becoming their own stories, and also with the passage of time, how they are now in a stage of life to reflect on, it's interesting to have somebody at the age of 70 saying, now I'm reflecting back at the age of 30. So how that process works.
No, thank you so much for the question. I think you're asking kind of what other aspects differ when you change kind of the interviewer. And I think, that's been an interesting kind of thing I've encountered in mine. I'm not Jewish, and that has been a question asked by one Kinder, where she wanted to know, why was I interested in this? What background did I have? And once I explained to her, my background and kind of my personal interest. And I do have a family member who, you know, married in, and his family were survivors. He escaped Czechoslovakia, but you know, so from a young age I had this interest, and so that kind of, you know, changed, I think, her perspective of me, and it, as you know, it's all kind of about the relationship building when you are interviewing someone. But I think, as people talked about yesterday with voter, you know, interviews, you have to look at who is asking the questions and where they're coming from, and that really colors everything. Not sure if that answered, but as far as where I'm planning to archive, I'm still figuring that out. I'm hoping to possibly archive multiple places, but the National Library of Wales, just because these interviews are so specific. And while some kinder I've interviewed, I've talked to them, you know, 6 or 7 times, and done their whole life. Some, like B, whose lives have been very well documented, I've focused just specifically on the time in Wales. So those interviews may appear a little bit more fragmented. So it's not a typical. I've learned to kind of be very flexible in this project, but it's been great.
Okay, thank you so much for your question. Actually, I haven't sort of stopped being able to think about what you asked me, and I'm trying to sort of fit it all in. Let me just say, first of all, in terms of audience, so I think definitely 1945, my father, as I tried to show, tried to write but didn't. I think that there was a sense to which Captain Sells was telling him that he needed to record it because he might be called to give testimony. I think what happened was that other people came back with their own stories. My father lived with an aunt that came back, and she refused to speak. She couldn't speak, and in fact she never spoke during her life, and I only found about where she was because I was lucky enough to spend some time in the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and they told me where she was. I think that there was this sense that, should I give testimony? Why are some other people not talking? Should I, you know, perhaps not talk either? Maybe I'm getting things wrong. Maybe, you know, so there's a lot of confusion there. 1995, I was still living at home. My father was getting sicker, and I was conscious of that. I had just finished my first degree in history. I asked him to write. I was very involved in it myself. I helped him collect the documents that I thought were relevant to put into that memory, and I think the fact that I pushed him to do it gave him a sense that he was also doing it for me. So I think that was very much part of it. But he was a very different person, and I really wanted to express that. He had become a very, you know, sort of founding member of the community that he was involved with in London. He was asked to speak consistently about his Holocaust memories every year at the Holocaust Memorial Day. And also he was very involved with the then chief rabbi, who was Emanuel Jacobowitz, to try and have a national Memorial Day, which wasn't around then. In fact, he was very frustrated that Jacobowitz wouldn't let him do that in England. So he sort of wasn't able to express that, and he writes about that in his book.
Hi. Also, thank you for the question. I'm so jealous of their English. It's really I have no good answer about the story of telling the story on first beguf rishon on first this. It's a good thing to check. From some aspect, being a second generation, yeah, is actually a separation between the parents and me. I'm a second generation. I'm the children. So there is some kind of a separation built in the status. But what is obviously you can see on Facebook groups is the evolution from shame to pride, from anger to love, from ignoring to commemoration. People that didn't know and didn't care where was this status somewhere in whatever, suddenly they give money in order to commemorate the community somewhere in Lita or somewhere in Poland or somewhere this. And this is a clear change. People are aware of the change. I didn't want to be part of this, and now I'm proud of this. I miss the parents. I was angry of them being crazy. That's their expression. Now I understand more. Now I care, I love, I miss what all this. So this is a clear thing that was happening in this second leg of second generation. But speaking on, there are some Pauline guides from Yad Vashem that are doing this first-hand commemoration, and it's interesting to have a further look at this.
I have a question for all the three of you. Thank you. It was very interesting, and also all three lectures together. So first to Anne, yes. I was wondering, you used the term child survivor for the Kindertransport children, and I'm not asking if it's right or wrong, no, but is there maybe also a shift in Britain that they are included into this child survivor fund or child survivor community, because we have this fund in Germany? And yeah, then I have a question to Catherine. I found it really interesting because later I will present also a case study. He was not family, but I was wondering how far in your analysis or reading of your father's testimonies, how much do the actual historical events play a role? Because I came to this when you said, why does he say their ghetto? Yes, because it's a freaky answer now, but I read a PhD about Riga, Kaiserwald. I was editing it. It's only published in German, and I know that in '43, exactly also on Yom Kippur, there were these mass shootings, and they also liquidated all the ghettos in the Balts, and maybe the rest of the living Jewish population were brought to the Riga ghetto. And maybe this is why he says they, and their ghetto. I mean, this brought me to the broader question, how much do the actual events, or do you say, okay, I do not need to know every single date, for me the memory is more important. And to Gila, I wanted to ask if you also interviewed grandchildren, because I had a small side research on second and third
generation. Now we're
speaking together about the first generation, and so only interested.
I have a question for Catherine. You mentioned the fact that in 1945 memoir, the episode of the corpses inside the house when they arrived in Riga is mentioned, is not mentioned, and it was mentioned in the later memoir.
The opposite. It's mentioned in the first one, not mentioned in the second.
Ah, okay. No, I understood the opposite. Anyway, because sometimes it happened, I remember, for instance, with Mark Grossman, past in hiding, I don't know, that sometimes these episodes are moved. I mean, to make a sense of an episode or an event, a very important event which has a symbolical value also for the future. So this happened. So it was in the 1945 and it was not in 1995. Okay. So I thought that it could have been, I was asking if it could have been, symbolic for something which was written immediately following that, or thank you.
Thank you for wonderful presentations. I have like a question and a comment for Anne and for Gila. I am just now doing repeated interviews with people, but the first interview did me myself too, so I can like follow the differences and all these things. But also this in these repeated interviews, there is the fact that those people are getting older. So sometimes grandsons or granddaughters are coming and guiding interviewees, and they try to stay together with us, and I really don't like this situation, because I know that there is really different situation for interview, and the interviewee is not so relaxed, or not maybe so relaxed, but definitely created a slightly different stories. And so my question is, will be this fact in your research report, who were present in the interview, and therefore we can look on this transcript or hear the interview in this way with these facts in hand. And Gila, there is a Facebook page, a group, Light, but in Slovak, Svetlo, and there are second generation members from previous Czechoslovakia who immigrated outside. And they had also meetings here in Jerusalem, in Prague, and so on. So I think, but this only in Czech and Slovak, so only information.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was very interesting to see these sort of like online Landsmannschaften, right? So it's kind of like Jiskr books being written in media res on Facebook. So, okay, let's tackle those last questions and then we'll go for a break.
So I think the child survivor question, I was mostly referring to kind of what Rebecca Clifford, her whole book was about child survivors, and in thinking of memory loss and nonlinear memory within child survivors. But that is a really interesting topic to bring up, because as Rebecca wrote about, children in hiding weren't often considered survivors for a long time. But when you think about it, their whole lives were uprooted and disrupted, and in that way, they came to view themselves as survivors later in life. But what's really common among kinder is they never would have ever called themselves survivors until 1989 was the 50-year reunion, and that was kind of when the story really came alive within the UK and the US as well. I've just been focusing on the UK, but I think a lot are still hesitant to use that term, only because they didn't experience the camps. They didn't have, they were some in relative safety, others, obviously everyone had a very different experience. But that is kind of a very personal choice, I think, whether they call themselves a survivor or not. So when I used that, I was kind of mentioning the research that Rebecca has done on child survivors. Oh, and the question on repeated interviews, and that's definitely something that I always make sure to kind of mark in transcripts who is there. With B, her son was there, and then I've done separate interviews with him and one of his brothers. A man I've been interviewing who lives in Jerusalem. We've been online interviewing 6 or 7 sessions, and his wife has been there for every single one, which is not necessarily what I anticipated, but it's actually been great, and again changes things, because when he doesn't quite remember something, she's there, but it's also helpful because whereas he is sometimes hesitant to share any sort of emotional story, he's quick to tell a joke, quick to launch into an anecdote. She will sometimes kind of bring that out of him, and so it is helpful in some ways, and again just totally changes the interview. So I think it is important within transcripts, if you are transcribing, to always kind of be clear about who is there, and as that does change things.
I'm very conscious when I answer these questions that you're all looking at me as a second generation person, so I'm going to sort of think about also how I respond them in the future. I'll think about how I'm responding to these questions. Events, great question. The difference between my father's story in 1945 and 1995, you really see much more of an understanding and a description of the Riga ghetto, something that I really couldn't go into just because I had a time limitation. interesting about the dates and the Yom Kippur that you mentioned, my father in 1945 describes nothing about his Jewishness, and I would say is so angry that he's Jewish that he can't even go there. In 1995, he talks about his Jewish home, he talks about his bar mitzvah, and that he goes to a private house to have his bar mitzvah reading, and there's a different way of thinking about being Jewish. And you really see that. And I'd be so delighted with pleasure for you to look at the stories yourself and to see what he does actually say about Riga, because I think that might be helpful for the student or for the person doing their PhD on that. This is the big question, I must tell you. I cannot even begin to say. I didn't read my father's 1945 description. It was too painful for me. It's so difficult, and I think that this fits in with what Gila said. There are things that we can do as second generation now that we couldn't do even in 1995 when my father wrote his story. And definitely if he was here, I would say, Dad, why on earth did you say this in 1945 and not mention the dead bodies? This was a real moment of crisis for me when I found out about these dead bodies, and I luckily was able to speak to Professor Amos Goldberg, professor of Holocaust testimony in the Hebrew University. He sat down with me and he said the following: your father was so traumatized by what he had to do to get rid of those bodies in 1945. He had never seen, probably, dead bodies before. And the actual process of removing those bodies meant that he could not go there in 1995. And I think that there was something so true about that. It left something that and he never spoke about it. We never knew about those dead bodies. It was just something not discussed.
I just want to say that I'm very interested in third generation and also in second and third generation in Germany. And we are trying to find people to work with because it's really interesting, of course. And there is, there's a lot. It's really interesting what's happening in Germany and how they deal with it, and what it means to be a second generation in their terms. I think that it's much more painful for them than for us, by the way. Amazing. I was once in a conference of Tavistock, I don't know if you know, of perpetrators and victims, and there was this huge representations of Germans, and they are like, it's easier to be the victim than the perpetrator in being a second generation. But this is, and that's it. So if you have any connections, this is really interesting.
Okay, great. Let's thank our speakers one last time.